The navigation computer died at 3:47 station time, and Kale Mora's freighter dropped out of superluminal transit 14 light-years off course, deep inside the Tessarine exclusion corridor. She knew it immediately, not because of the alarms, those came 2 seconds later, shrill and useless, but because the stars outside her viewport were wrong. The Orion spur should have been at her port quarter. Instead, she was staring at the blue-white furnace of a K-class variable she'd never seen before, close enough that its radiation was already cooking her forward sensor array. The Juno Kite was a Terran-registered cargo hauler, 72 meters stem to stern, carrying 40 tons of pharmaceutical base stock bound for the Murin Colony Dispensary. She was not a warship. She was not armored. She had 1-point defense turret rated for microdebris, and a hull integrity system designed for the gentle stresses of commercial transit lanes. She was not supposed to be here. The nav computer's main board was dead, not sleeping, not rebooting, dead. The holographic projection above the console showed nothing but static. Kale hammered the diagnostic sequence 3 times before the secondary display flickered and gave her a partial readout: catastrophic firmware corruption. The update she'd installed at Port Jessen had carried a cascade fault nobody had caught. Her entire navigational suite, star charts, transit calculations, orientation fixes, emergency return protocols, was gone. She was flying blind in hostile space. The Tessarine exclusion corridor belonged to the Vorathi sovereignty, a civilization that had declared a 200 light-year buffer around their core systems and enforced it with autonomous patrol drones. Terran ships had no transit agreement, no diplomatic channel, no recognition treaty. The Vorathi didn't shoot human ships on sight, they'd never encountered one inside their borders. But the automated defense protocols didn't distinguish between species. They distinguished between authorized transponder signatures and everything else. Kale's transponder was screaming Terran civilian in a zone where that meant nothing except target. She had maybe 40 minutes before the nearest patrol grid pinged her position and dispatched an intercept drone. The drones didn't negotiate. They disabled propulsion, locked the hull in a tractor envelope, and hauled the offending vessel to a processing station where it would sit for months while Vorathi bureaucrats decided what to do with it. Months without oxygen resupply. Months without food beyond her emergency rations. Months in a cage built for ships that didn't need to breathe. Unless she moved. Kale killed every non-essential system. The pharmaceutical cargo bay went dark. Life support dropped to minimum recycling. She cranked the CO2 scrubbers to their lowest power draw, cut the temperature regulation to passive thermal, and shut down the water recycler entirely. She routed every watt she could find to the sublight engines and the one system that might save her life, the emergency distress beacon. The beacon was Terran Standard, encrypted on Coalition Emergency Band 7, a frequency reserved for human vessels in distress, monitored by Terran patrol stations scattered across the frontier. The nearest station was at Jessen, 31 light-years away. At superluminal relay speed, her signal would reach Jessen in approximately 6 hours. A rescue ship, if one was available, if Jessen had anything faster than a refueling tender, might reach her in another 14. 20 hours minimum before help arrived. She didn't have 20 hours. She had 40 minutes. Kale punched the beacon active and started transmitting. Not a standard SOS. She didn't have time for clean formatting. She opened a raw telemetry stream. Ship status, position estimate, threat assessment, and her own voice, clipped and flat, narrating every action she took. If she died out here, at least the beacon record would tell Terran Patrol what happened. At least her family would know she'd been working the problem when the air ran out. Terran vessel Juno Kite, registry TCV 7741, Mora commanding. Position estimate, Tessarine exclusion corridor, approximately 14 light-years off my filed transit route. Nav computer total failure, firmware cascade fault, no recovery possible from onboard resources, hostile sovereign space, autonomous intercept likely within 40 minutes. I am working the problem. The first drone found her at 4:09. It was a Vorathi interceptor, a sleek autonomous thing, matte black, no larger than her cargo bay, angular in a way that suggested function stripped of any aesthetic consideration. It dropped out of a micro-jump 600 meters off her port bow and immediately began cycling its tractor emitters. The electromagnetic signature was unmistakable. It was locking on. Kale didn't wait. She'd been running engine calculations since the nav computer died, working them by hand on her secondary console with a stylus on a scratch display, and she had one card left. The Juno Kite's sublight engines were rated for 0.4 G sustained thrust. But the safety governors existed because the hull wasn't rated for the stress, not because the engines couldn't push harder. She bypassed the governor on engine 2, fed it a redline burn command, and rolled the ship 45 degrees starboard while punching full lateral thrust. The freighter screamed. Hull stress alarms joined the navigation alarms in a chorus of mechanical protest. Rivets in the cargo bay partition groaned. The drone's tractor lock slipped. It had calculated her mass and acceleration based on a standard freighter profile, and she'd exceeded that profile by 30% in a direction it wasn't expecting. She bought herself 90 seconds. 90 seconds in which the drone recalculated, adjusted its approach vector, and began closing again. But 90 seconds in which Kale Mora spotted something on her passive sensors that made her chest unclench by one fraction. An asteroid field, dense and metallic, 17,000 kilometers ahead. The K-class variable's radiation had made her active sensors useless. The M interference painted everything in noise, but passive thermals cut through the wash and showed the field clearly. Thousands of iron-nickel rocks tumbling through the star's corona discharge, like a slow-motion avalanche frozen in orbit. A drone couldn't follow her into that, not safely. Its programming would flag the debris density as unacceptable risk to its own hardware and hold position at the field's edge, waiting for her to emerge or suffocate. The algorithms didn't care which. She wouldn't emerge. Not for a long time. Not until help came or she figured out how to fix her nav computer with nothing but a secondary diagnostic terminal and whatever she could cannibalize from the cargo hold. Kale aimed for the densest cluster she could find and pushed the engines past every limit their designers had intended. The Juno Kite hit the asteroid field at 1.6 kilometers per second relative. The point defense turret spun up automatically, tracking microdebris on its own independent processor, pulsing low-yield kinetic shots at anything on a collision vector. The first impacts rattled through the hull like hail on sheet metal, pebble-sized fragments, deflecting off the forward plating with sharp pings that Kale felt through the deck. Then something larger, the size of her fist, punched clean through the upper cargo bay wall. The breach alarm wailed. Atmosphere began bleeding from Bay 2, a thin whistle of escaping air that she could hear even through the bulkhead. The pharmaceutical stock in that section, 6 tons of temperature-sensitive compound, was exposed to vacuum and would be ruined in minutes. 6 tons of medicine that colony children on Murren needed. Kale sealed Bay 2 and kept flying. The medicine was dead. She was not. That was the only calculation that mattered right now. She threaded the Juno Kite between 2 tumbling boulders each larger than her ship, rolled through a gap so narrow that her starboard sensor mast scraped rock and snapped off with a sound like a tree branch breaking, and finally settled into the shadow of a kilometer-wide iron asteroid that blocked the drone's line of sight completely. The asteroid's mass would also scatter any focused sensor beams the drone aimed at the field. She was hidden behind 1 billion tons of iron. She checked her passive sensors. The drone was holding at the field's edge, exactly as predicted. Its tractor emitters were cycling down to standby. It would wait for her like a patient predator at a burrow entrance. Let it wait. Kale Mora was alone in an asteroid field, in hostile space, with no navigation, no star charts, one breached cargo bay, a broken sensor mast, 6 tons of ruined medicine, and approximately 9 hours of oxygen at minimum recycling rates. 9 hours. That number was a cage. Everything she did from this moment would either open that cage or die inside it. She started talking into the beacon again. Not because she thought anyone was listening. The relay at Jessen wouldn't receive her signal for hours yet. But because the habit of reporting kept her thinking in straight lines, kept panic at arm's length, kept her brain solving instead of spiraling. Mara, Juno Kite. Update at 4:22. I am sheltering in an asteroid field to avoid Vorathi autonomous intercept. One drone holding at field perimeter, tractor emitters on standby. I have 9 hours of oxygen at current consumption. Sublight engines functional but engine 2 running beyond rated thermal limits from the redline burn. Hull breach in bay 2 sealed non-critical. Starboard sensor mast lost. I am not injured. She paused, drew breath. I am working the problem. Working the problem meant inventory. Kale pulled herself out of the pilot's seat. The Juno Kite had no artificial gravity when running on minimum power. She'd been operating in microgravity since she killed the gravity plating to save watts, and floated back through the narrow corridor to the engineering section, pulling herself along the ceiling handholds with the ease of someone who'd spent 8 years in space. The nav computer's physical hardware was intact: memory cores, processing boards, crystal arrays. She ran her hand over the main board, feeling the cool surface of dead circuitry. The corruption was in the firmware layer, the operating instructions that told the hardware what to do with its own processing power. Without those instructions, the hardware was expensive furniture, a brain with no mind in it. She needed firmware. She needed a copy of the nav computer's operating system loaded onto a medium she could flash to the corrupted cores. She didn't have one. The backup partition had been on the same board that corrupted, a design decision some engineer had made to save weight and power, and which Kale was currently composing a very detailed complaint letter about in the back of her mind. Terran ships carried physical backup crystals in their emergency kits. Regulation required it, but her kit was 3 years out of date. The crystal in her emergency locker contained firmware version 4.1. Her nav computer ran version 7.6. The architecture had changed twice since 4.1. Loading it would be like trying to run modern navigation software on hardware built 2 generations ago. The handshakes wouldn't match. The memory maps wouldn't align. The inertial reference protocols would speak different languages. Unless she bridged the gap. Kale opened every technical manual stored on her secondary console, the one independent computer that hadn't been touched by the Cascade fault because it ran its own isolated operating system for life support management. The Juno Kite's secondary was a basic life support and comms management terminal, not designed for navigation, not connected to the nav board's data bus. But it had a text library, service bulletins, engineering notes. The complete changelog between firmware versions 4.1 and 7.6. Every modification, every architecture change, every protocol update, documented in the dry technical prose of Terran shipboard computing standards. If she could manually patch version 4.1 to make it compatible with her 7.6 hardware, line by line, instruction by instruction, building a bridge between the old architecture and the new, creating adapter layers for every incompatibility, she could restore basic navigation. Not full capability, not transit calculations or superluminal plotting, but enough to know which direction she was pointing, enough to fly out of this field without hitting a rock, enough to aim for the corridor boundary. The changelog listed 11 critical architecture changes between 4.1 and 7.6, 11 bridges she'd need to build. She had documentation for 7 of them, complete enough that she could write the patch code directly. The remaining 4 would require improvised solutions. Guesses, informed by 20 years of pilot training and 8 years of field experience with Terran nav systems. Guesses that would either work or crash the crystal into a boot loop. It would take hours she might not have. She started anyway. At 500, 1 hour and 13 minutes after the nav failure, Kale transmitted her second formal status update. Her voice was steady, clinical, a pilot reporting to a frequency she believed was 31 light-years from the nearest ear. Mara Juno Kite, oxygen at 7 hours 40 minutes. I am attempting a manual firmware bridge from version 4.1 emergency crystal to version 7.6 hardware. Estimated completion time, unknown. 11 critical architecture changes between versions. I have documentation for 7. The remaining 4 require improvised adapter code. Starting with the memory mapping table, that's the foundation. If I get that wrong, nothing else will load. She did not say, I am terrified. She did not say, no one is listening. She did not say, if I get one line of this patch wrong, the nav computer will boot into a fatal loop and I'll have spent hours of oxygen on nothing. She said, I am working the problem, more out. The Vorathi Patrol Network registered the Juno Kite's presence at 4:11 station time, 22 minutes after Kale dropped out of transit, when the intercept drone's telemetry reported a contact that fled into the asteroid field rather than accepting tractor lock. This was unusual. In the Sovereignty's enforcement records spanning 43 years of corridor patrol, no contact had ever fled into the Tessarine Belt. The belt was a hazard. Ships that entered it at speed did not emerge intact. The contact had entered at 1.6 kilometers per second. The drone's assessment, probable self-termination. The report filtered upward through 3 layers of automated processing before reaching an organic analyst. Senior Monitor Drethais Vaughn, 16 years in the Sovereignty's Corridor Enforcement Division, reviewed the contact summary at 4:35 from his station on monitoring platform Kethori, a Vorathi installation orbiting the inner boundary of the exclusion corridor. He flagged the contact for manual assessment rather than automatic resolution. Something didn't fit. The contact's transponder signature was unrecognized. Not hostile flagged, the system had no category for it at all. The signature didn't exist in any database the Sovereignty maintained. The vessel was small, consistent with a civilian cargo carrier, energy emissions suggesting no weapons beyond basic debris deflection capability. Its acceleration during evasion had exceeded standard profiles for its mass class, which the drone's after-action log noted with what Drethais privately thought of as algorithmic confusion. But what caught his attention, what made him lean forward in his monitoring chair and call up the raw signal data, was the broadcast. The vessel was transmitting continuously on a frequency the Sovereignty didn't use. It was encrypted, but the encryption was commercial-grade Coalition emergency band protocol. Drethais recognized the header structure from intelligence briefings he'd read years ago about Terran communication systems. The encryption had been rated in those briefings as adequate for civilian use, trivially decryptable by military-grade analysis. He ran a decryption pass. It took 14 seconds. What came through was a voice, organic, clear, speaking a language the translation matrix identified after a 3-second processing delay as Terran Standard English. Female harmonic register, controlled cadence, the measured delivery of someone who was afraid but had decided that fear was not going to make her decisions for her. Drethais Vaughn had never heard a human speak. The Sovereignty had records of the Terran Coalition fragmentary, gathered from third-party trade data, long-range survey sweeps, and occasional intercepted transmissions from Coalition vessels passing near the corridor's outer boundary. Humans existed. They occupied a region of space roughly 40 light-years from the Sovereignty's borders. There was no diplomatic contact, no transit agreement, no hostility. Simply nothing. Two civilizations that had never found sufficient reason to make the effort of introduction. Now one of them was speaking inside his space, and Drethais Vaughn was listening. He played the translated signal from the beginning. Terran vessel Juno Kite, registry TCV 7741, Mora commanding. Position estimate, Tessarine exclusion corridor, approximately 14 light-years off my filed transit route. Nav computer total failure. Drethais listened to the entire first transmission, then the second. He leaned back in his monitoring chair, fingers steepled in the Vorathi gesture of sustained consideration, and stared at the signal trace on his console. A human pilot was trapped in the Tessarine belt inside sovereignty space. Her navigation had failed catastrophically. She had hours of air. She was hiding from his drone behind an asteroid the size of a small city. And she was broadcasting her survival efforts on what she clearly believed was an empty frequency, unaware that the sovereignty's passive monitoring arrays caught every electromagnetic emission within the corridor, regardless of band or encryption grade. He should have filed a standard unauthorized incursion report, dispatched a second drone to the belt perimeter, waited for the pilot to emerge or expire, then recovered the vessel for analysis. Standard procedure. Clean, efficient, uninvolved. By the time she'd be processed through sovereignty channels, her oxygen would be a memory. Drethais flagged the contact for extended observation, a category that froze the automated response queue and held the drone in passive mode. He didn't file the incursion report. He told himself it was because the situation was unprecedented and required more data before categorization. He kept listening. At 5:48, the human transmitted again. Mora, Juno Kite, oxygen at 6 hours 12 minutes. I've completed the memory mapping patch, the first and most critical bridge between the 4.1 crystal and the 7.6 hardware. 5 architecture bridges complete out of 11. The nav crystal accepted the first 5 patch blocks without rejection errors. A pause, the sound of something being tapped, a stylus against a display perhaps. Engine 2's thermal readings are elevated from the earlier redline burn. I've throttled it to idle to cool the manifold. Engine 1 nominal. The drone is still holding at field perimeter, no change in posture. No additional contacts on passive scan. I have 6 more bridges to build, and 2 of them are the improvised ones. Another pause, then in a tone that shifted slightly, not softer but more personal, as if the pilot had momentarily forgotten she was speaking for a record. If anyone receives this at Jessen Station, tell my brother David his dog still owes me a shoe. Long story. Inside joke. Probably not the kind of thing you put in an official distress log, but if I die out here, I want somebody to laugh about it. Then back to the flat professional tone, Mora out. Drethais Vaughn did not smile. Vorathi physiognomy didn't express amusement the way humans did. But something in his posture shifted, a settling, a leaning forward that his console's biometric readout would have registered as increased engagement. He was no longer monitoring a contact. He was listening to a person. By 6:15, 3 more analysts had joined Drethais at his station. Word had spread through the monitoring floor the way unusual signals always did, a murmur across stations, a head turn, a junior analyst walking over with a datapad and saying, "Senior monitor, you should hear this." Analyst Kethais, 30 years in corridor enforcement, steady as a harbor wall, had taken the adjacent station and was running a parallel translation buffer to catch any signal the primary missed. Young Pelani, barely 2 years certified, was monitoring the drone telemetry and cross-referencing the human vessel's energy emissions with their fragmentary Terran database. The Juno Kite's transmissions played on Drethais's console speakers, while 4 Vorathi officials listened to a human-woman fight to stay alive 30 light-years from her own kind. Kale's 4th transmission, 631 carried a new edge. Her voice was tighter. The control was still there, still absolute, but the control itself was visible now, like watching someone hold a heavy door shut with their shoulder. Mora Juno Kite, oxygen at 5 hours 48 minutes, I have a problem. The monitoring floor went quiet. Bridge 7, the inertial reference handshake between the Legacy 4.1 coordinate system and the 7.6 orientation matrix. The changelog references a timing calibration for the handshake protocol, but doesn't include the actual calibration values. It says, refer to Technical Service Bulletin 7.641. I don't have TSB 7.641. It's not in my secondaries library. It was probably distributed through the NAV Computer's update network, which is the system that's dead. A pause, the sound of breathing measured, deliberate, in, out, the rhythm of someone refusing to let their heart rate climb. Without those calibration values, the NAV computer will boot but won't know which direction is up. Orientation data will be garbage, random noise that looks like valid output. I could fly straight into a rock thinking I was flying parallel to it. The system won't know the difference, and neither will I. Another pause, longer. I'm going to derive the values manually. In the monitoring room, Kethais looked at Drethais. The look said, how? The answer came in the next sentence from Kale Mora's transmission. My secondary console has access to the point defense turret's tracking logs. Every shot the turret took during my run into the asteroid field, every debris fragment it identified, calculated a firing solution for, and engaged, was computed against a fixed inertial reference frame. The turret knows which way is up. It has to, or it can't aim. If I can back-calculate the turret's reference constants from its 847 logged firing solutions, isolate the inertial reference values by working backward from the targeting math, I can rebuild the calibration table from scratch and feed it to the nav crystal. A pause, then almost conversationally, I don't know if this will work. I've never heard of anyone doing it, but the math is the math. If the turret could solve for debris trajectories, then the trajectory solutions contain the orientation data I need. I just have to dig it out. Drethais turned to Kethais. Is that possible? Kethais, who had studied weapons systems mathematics at the Sovereignty's Technical Academy 40 years ago, thought about it for 6 seconds. Theoretically. The firing solution requires a stable reference frame, angular orientation, rotational velocity, positional derivatives. Those values are embedded in every targeting calculation. Extracting them is a matter of algebraic inversion across a sufficient sample set. 847 samples, Pelani said quietly. More than sufficient, Kethais confirmed. If she can write the extraction algorithm correctly, and if the turret's reference frame is precise enough for navigation-grade work, which it may not be, turret calibration is typically less precise than navigation calibration. How much less precise? Hundredths of a percent, perhaps thousandths, enough to navigate out of an asteroid field, certainly. Perhaps not enough for superluminal plotting. She doesn't need superluminal, Drethais said. She needs to know which way the rocks are. He turned back to the console and listened. At 7:12, after 41 minutes of silence broken only by telemetry, the Juno Kite's automated systems dutifully reporting hull temperature, atmosphere composition, power draw, Kale Mora's voice returned. And it carried something new, triumph. Exhausted triumph, compressed into flat professional syllables, but unmistakable. Mora Juno Kite, oxygen at 4 hours 52 minutes, I have the calibration values. Pelani made a sound, a soft exhale that in Vorathi emotional vocabulary signified released tension. 41 minutes of back calculation, across 847 turret firing solutions. Consistent inertial reference frame extracted with a margin of error of 0.003%. That's navigation grade, more than adequate for sublight orientation, patching it into the firmware bridge now. Her voice steadied further, the sound of someone who can see the summit. 3 more architecture bridges to go. 2 are minor display formatting and diagnostic output channels. The last one is the star chart indexing protocol. I can't bridge it properly without access to the full 7.6 chart database, which I don't have. But I can fake it, write a minimal index that maps to the 4.1 Crystal's legacy chart set. The charts will be 30 years out of date. Stars don't move that fast. It'll do. In the monitoring room, the count of listeners had grown to 11. The station's duty commander, Commander Kareth Voss, tall even for a Vorathi, with the gray-blue rank bands of 30 years' service marking her collar, had appeared at some point during the last hour. She stood at the back of the cluster, arms folded in the Vorathi posture of command observation, saying nothing. Her presence had silenced the murmurs. Everyone was simply listening now. Nobody had filed any reports. Nobody had dispatched any additional drones. Nobody had done anything procedural since 4:35. At 7:34, Kale transmitted again. Her voice was fraying at the edges now, not fear, but exhaustion. She'd been working at maximum cognitive output for nearly 4 hours without rest, without food, in cold air and growing CO2. Mora Juno Kite, oxygen at 4 hours 9 minutes. Bridges 8 through 10 complete, display formatting, diagnostic output, and star chart index. The chart index is a hack. I know it's a hack. The nav computer is going to think it's 2347 when it boots, but it'll have orientation, propulsion plotting capability, and charts that are close enough to navigate by at sublight speeds. A breath in, out. Bridge 11, the boot handshake. The firmware has to present credentials to the hardware in a specific encrypted format when it starts up, a security measure to prevent unauthorized firmware from running on Terran navigation systems. Version 4.1's credentials won't match what the 7.6 hardware expects. If I can't solve this, the crystal boots, the hardware rejects it, and I get a hard lockout. The monitoring room was very still. I need to crack my own ship's security protocol. Another pause. Kale's voice went flat and precise, the voice of someone laying out the parameters of a math problem with their life riding on the answer. The credential format is documented in the 4.1 manual as a hash of the ship's registry, the crystal's serial number, and a rotating seed value. The rotating seed in 7.6 is different from 4.1, but the hash algorithm itself hasn't changed, only the seed generation method. If I can determine what seed the 7.6 hardware is expecting for the current boot cycle, I can calculate the correct credential hash and inject it into the 4.1 firmware startup sequence. She almost laughed, a single sharp breath that wasn't quite humor but wasn't quite despair either. The irony of bypassing my own ship's anti-tampering system while trying to save the ship is not lost on me. How do I find the seed? The seed is generated from the ship's internal clock. The clock is on the main board. The main board is dead. But the clock's crystal oscillator, the physical timepiece, is a separate hardware component. It runs on its own power cell. I can read it directly if I pull the clock crystal out of the main board and interface it with my secondary console's diagnostic port. Kale went silent. In the monitoring room, 11 Vorathi listened to the sounds of physical labor transmitted through an open microphone, the snap of access panels, the soft grunt of a body pulling itself through a maintenance crawlspace in microgravity, the click of tools being applied to circuitry. Then a satisfied sound. Got it. She was back at her secondary console in 2 minutes. The calculations took another 4. Seed identified, hash calculated, credential block injected into the firmware patch, bridge 11 complete. She said it simply, the way you say something that was never supposed to be possible and then was. I'm compiling the full firmware image now, all 11 bridges, all patches. The fake chart index, the turret-derived calibration, the credential bypass. Loading to the nav crystal in 60 seconds. If this works, I have navigation. If it doesn't, I have approximately 4 hours to think of something else. Loading now. Kareth Voss spoke for the first time. Her voice was quiet, directed at no one in particular but heard by everyone. How long has she been working? 4 hours and 47 minutes continuously, Drethais replied without looking away from his console. On how much air? She started with 9 hours. She's used roughly half. And she's been alone the entire time. Yes. Kareth Voss said nothing else. She watched the signal feed. 20 seconds of silence from the Juno kite. The telemetry continued. Oxygen levels. CO2 climbing slowly, hull temperature steady. Power draw elevated on the secondary console as it compiled and transferred data. But no voice. Then, boot sequence initiated. Another 5 seconds. Self-test running. Memory map confirmed. Architecture bridges 11 of 11 validated. Inertial reference handshake green. Star chart index loaded green with legacy flag. Credential verification. 3 seconds that lasted a year. Accepted full boot. Navigation online. Her voice cracked. Just once. Just for a single syllable. Then it was steady again, but the crack had been there, and everyone in the Vorathi monitoring room heard it. I have orientation. I can see which way I'm pointing. I have propulsion plotting. I have charts, old charts, but real charts. I can fly out of this field without hitting anything. A long breath, I can get out. In the monitoring room, Pelani's hands were shaking. Kethais was leaning back in his chair with his eyes closed, a Vorathi gesture of profound relief that had no human equivalent more articulate than a deep sigh. Drethais Vaughn's hands were flat on his console, pressed down as if anchoring himself. He turned to look at Duty Commander Kareth Voss. Her expression was unreadable by human standards, but to another Vorathi it was unmistakable. The absolute stillness of someone making a command decision that would end one way or another in the history books. Senior Monitor, she said. How far is our nearest manned vessel? The patrol cruiser Tessarine's Reach is 34 minutes out at standard cruise. The human's oxygen. 4 hours 9 minutes as of her last report. But active flight through the asteroid field will increase her metabolic rate significantly. At flight level exertion, I estimate 90 minutes of useful consciousness. Can she reach the corridor boundary in 90 minutes on sublight? Drethais ran the calculation on his console. The numbers came back cold. No, the nearest boundary point is 6 hours and 14 minutes at her vessel's maximum sustainable thrust. Then she will die before she can leave our space. Yes, unless she finds additional oxygen or reduces her consumption below survivable minimums. Kareth Voss turned to face the entire monitoring cluster. 11 analysts looked back at her. Recall the intercept drone, she said. Deploy Tessarine's Reach on a direct course to the human vessel's position. Approach with all weapons cold. Transponder broadcasting a non-hostile identification on the human's frequency, hailing on their Band 7 channel with a machine translation of the following. We have monitored your situation. We are approaching to assist. Weapons are inactive. Signal the cruiser's engineering team to prepare oxygen, hull repair materials, and navigation data packages. She paused. The room was absolutely silent. We are not intercepting an intruder. We are responding to a distress call that was never addressed to us. Log the encounter as a distress response under humanitarian exemption. I'll write the justification for the council myself. Commander, Drethais said carefully, his voice carrying the weight of a man who agreed completely but needed the objection on record. We have no diplomatic protocol with the Terran coalition. We have no first contact procedures. We have no humanitarian exemption provision in the corridor enforcement statutes. Then I'm creating one, Kareth Voss said. Right now. The Council can draft their formal procedures around our after-action report. Dispatch the cruiser, Senior Monitor. Drethais von dispatched the cruiser. Kale didn't know any of this. She didn't know anyone had been listening. She didn't know her signal, encrypted for Terran ears, broadcast on a band no local species should have been able to crack, carrying nothing but survival telemetry and the stubborn voice of a woman refusing to die, had been playing in a Vorathi monitoring room for nearly 5 hours, while a civilization that had never met her species listened to her solve the unsolvable. She knew she had navigation. She knew she had 4 hours of air. She knew the corridor boundary was 6 hours away. She knew the math didn't close. She ran the numbers again, looking for an angle, checked her course plot for shorter exits, side boundaries, disputed zones, anything closer than 6 hours. Nothing. The Tessarine corridor was 200 light-years of sovereign space in every direction that wasn't back the way she'd come. And back the way she'd come required a superluminal transit. She couldn't plot without the systems. She just spent 5 hours patching around. The math didn't close. Not by 2 hours. She could fly for 4 hours and then suffocate, conscious, at the controls of a ship that knew exactly where it was going but couldn't get there in time. She refused. Mora Juno Kite, I have navigation. I don't have enough air. Discrepancy, approximately 2 hours short. I need to either find more oxygen or reduce consumption below the minimums I'm already running. She was already moving toward the cargo bay. Options. Bay 1 is intact, sealed, and pressurized. Contents, 34 tons of pharmaceutical base stock. I'm pulling up the manifest now. The manifest scrolled on her secondary display as she floated through the Bay 1 access corridor. Chemical names, quantities, storage conditions. She read them with the eye of someone who'd taken 3 semesters of chemistry before switching to a piloting program and never expected that knowledge to matter again. Calcium peroxide, 14 kilograms. Decomposes at temperatures above 200 Celsius, releasing molecular oxygen. That's a yes. She kept scrolling. Sodium percarbonate, 22 kilograms. Releases oxygen when dissolved in water at elevated temperatures. I don't have spare water to dissolve it in. I shut the recycler down. Scratch that unless I can find water. More scrolling. Potassium permanganate, 9 kilograms. Strong oxidizer. Will release oxygen if heated past decomposition point. More volatile than the calcium peroxide. I'd need to be more careful with the temperature control. Secondary option. She calculated. 14 kilograms of calcium peroxide at full decomposition yields approximately 6.4 kilograms of molecular oxygen. At my current metabolic rate with reduced activity, that's roughly 3 additional hours of breathable air. 3 hours added to 4 gives me 7. I need 6 hours 14 minutes. 7 is enough. 7 closes the math. Her voice had shifted, not relief, not yet, but the fierce flat certainty of someone who can see the answer and now just has to execute. I need a heat source capable of sustained 200+ Celsius in a contained volume. She found it in 30 seconds of looking. Engine 2's thermal exhaust manifold runs through the wall between engineering and Bay 1. That's why Bay 2 was designated for the temperature-sensitive stock. The manifold carries waste heat from the engine at operating temperatures between 180 and 340 Celsius, depending on thrust level. A beat. I can route Engine 2's exhaust heat through the manifold, raise the temperature in a sealed section of Bay 1 above 200, and decompose the calcium peroxide in a controlled reaction. The released oxygen vents through the standard atmospheric exchange port into the main life support loop. She paused one final time. This is going to make the cargo bay smell like a chemical plant. And if I miscalculate the temperature and hit 400 Celsius instead of 200, the potassium permanganate in the adjacent container will decompose explosively, and I'll have a different problem. Then, almost to herself, in a voice that was pure human stubbornness compressed into 6 words, "So I won't miscalculate the temperature." Kale set up her improvised oxygen generation system in 23 minutes. She repositioned the calcium peroxide containers to the manifold adjacent section, sealed that section with manual bulkhead dividers she cranked closed by hand, moved the potassium permanganate as far from the heat source as the bay geometry allowed, and throttled engine 2 up to 60% thrust, just enough to drive manifold temperatures to 230 Celsius. The containers began warming immediately. The calcium peroxide decomposed at 212 Celsius. At 230, the reaction was steady and sustainable. Oxygen gas released from the solid compound as it broke down, filling the sealed section with breathable air that the atmospheric exchange port, a simple one-way pressure valve, channeled into the main life support loop. Her O2 gauge began climbing for the first time in 5 hours. She transmitted at 8:23. Mora, Juno Kite, oxygen generation active. Supply climbing, estimate I now have 7 hours of breathable air, adequate for boundary transit with 30-minute margin. I'm going to start my run in 10 minutes once the oxygen generation has reached steady state. A small pause. The voice carried something that wasn't triumph and wasn't relief. It was more like the silence after you finish a marathon, the knowledge that you did the thing, and the inability to feel anything about it yet because your body is still running on the chemicals it needed for survival. This cargo manifest saved my life. 14 kilograms of calcium peroxide. Whoever put that on the packing list for a dispensary shipment, I'll buy them a drink if I ever find out who they are. In the Vorathi monitoring room, the atmosphere had shifted fundamentally. It was no longer surveillance. It was no longer curiosity, or even the absorbed interest of professionals watching an unusual event. It was something closer to what humans might have called awe, though the Vorathi word for it, Keth Vorai, carried specific connotations of disbelief at an impossibility that then occurred anyway, witnessed personally rather than reported. Duty Commander Kareth Voss spoke. She's generating oxygen from cargo chemicals. Using her own engine exhaust as a furnace, Pelani added. At precise temperature control to avoid detonating the permanganate in the adjacent container. Status on Tessarine's reach. 24 minutes from intercept position, Drethais reported. The cruiser is running at standard cruise. If I authorize emergency speed, they can be there in 14. Authorize emergency speed. Done. Will she still have oxygen when they arrive? At her current generation rate, comfortably. She's solved her own problem, but the star charts she's running are 30 years out of date, and the corridor has been remapped twice since then. If she flies a legacy chart at full thrust through current asteroid density, she might fly into something that didn't exist 30 years ago. Yes. Kareth Voss was still for 2 seconds. We're bringing her current charts. Tell the engineering team to prepare a full corridor navigation package, translated to Terran coordinate format. We're not just giving her oxygen, we're giving her a map. The Tessarine's reach appeared on Kale's passive sensors at 8:41. A contact, large, fast, accelerating hard on a vector that could only be aimed at her position. Not a drone. Something with a crew compartment, something with engine signatures that spoke of real mass and real power. Her hand went to the thrust control, fight or flight, the oldest calculation. Then her comms console lit up. A transmission, incoming on band 7, her frequency, the one nobody here should be able to read. Machine translated into English, slightly formal in the way that automated translation always was, but perfectly clear. Terran vessel Juno Kite. This is Tessarine's Reach Vorathi Sovereignty Patrol Vessel. We have monitored your transmissions. We are approaching with all weapons inactive to provide assistance. We carry oxygen, hull repair materials, engineering support, and current navigation data for the Tessarine corridor. Please acknowledge. Kael Mora stared at the console display. The words sat there, glowing softly in the dim cockpit, because she was still running on minimum power, still conserving, still rationing watts she no longer needed to ration. They'd been listening. The understanding arrived in stages. First, someone local had decoded her transmissions. Second, they'd been listening long enough to know she needed oxygen, hull repair, and charts. Third, they dispatched a crewed vessel, not a drone, a crewed vessel to help. Fourth, and this was the one that made her hands begin to shake, they said they'd been monitoring her transmissions, plural, for hours. They'd heard her patch her nav computer from weapons data. They'd heard her crack her own ship's security protocol. They'd heard her manufacture oxygen from pharmaceutical stock using an engine manifold as a kiln. They'd heard every stubborn, procedural, refusing to die transmission she'd made into what she'd believed was dead air. 5 hours of her talking to herself, and somebody had been listening the entire time. She keyed the transmit. Her voice came out hoarse. The cold air and the code 2 had been working on her throat for hours, and she hadn't noticed until now. Tessarine's Reach, this is Juno Kite Mora commanding. I acknowledge. Yes. I would welcome the assistance. The Vorathi patrol cruiser decelerated into visual range 11 minutes later. Kael watched it through her viewport as it resolved from a point of light into a shape, curved, elegant, pale blue-gray hull material that caught the K-class star's light like polished river stone. Larger than the Juno Kite by a factor of 3, with the unmistakable lines of a ship built by people who cared what their ships looked like. Nothing at all like the matte black angular brutality of the drone that had chased her. This was a crewed vessel. It looked like people lived inside it. It looked like someone's workplace, not someone's weapon. They extended a docking umbilical, a flexible pressurized tube that reached across the gap between their hull and hers like a hand offered. Kael matched her airlock rotation using her newly patched navigation system, carefully, aware that her orientation data was turret-derived, and her charts were 30 years out of date, and her margin for error was measured in meters, and locked on. The seal pressurized. Clean air, warm, properly humidified, at a pressure that made her ears pop after hours of the Juno Kite's thin, cold emergency atmosphere. Her airlock inner door opened. Standing on the other side was a Vorathi officer. Taller than Kael by nearly a head, which put him well over 2 meters. Angular features, skin the smooth blue-gray of slate, eyes that reflected ambient light with a faint silver iridescence. His uniform was dark with silver trim, professional without being martial. At his collar, a translation device the size of a coin pulsed with a soft blue light. His expression, to whatever extent Kael could read an alien face she'd never seen before, belonging to a species she'd never encountered in person, was something between professional composure and a quieter thing underneath. The look of someone who'd been watching you climb a cliff for 5 hours and had just seen you reach the top. "Pilot Mora," he said. The translation device rendered his voice into English with only slight mechanical overtones. "I am Senior Monitor Drethais Vaughn, Corridor Enforcement Division. I have been listening to your transmissions for 4 hours and 54 minutes. Kael blinked, swallowed. "You decoded my encryption." "In 14 seconds, Drethais said. There might have been the faintest inflection of something, not quite apology, not quite amusement. Your commercial-grade encryption is not rated against military monitoring systems." A pause. Kael's legs, which had been holding her upright through hours of crisis on nothing but stubbornness and adrenaline, decided that now that the crisis was over, now that someone else was here, now that survival was no longer solely her responsibility, They were done. She leaned against the airlock frame and let it hold her weight. I was broadcasting to a relay at Jessen Station, she said, 31 light years away. I didn't think anyone here could hear me. We hear everything in our space, Drethai said simply. It is what monitoring stations do. And you, what? Listened to me talk to myself for 5 hours and then decided to help. Drethai's Vaughn was quiet for a moment. Behind him in the umbilical corridor, Kale could see movement, 2 more Vorathi carrying equipment. Oxygen tanks in frame-mounted arrays, a tool case with markings she couldn't read, something that looked like a medical scanner. Normally, Drethai said, we would have filed an unauthorized incursion report and dispatched a recovery team. Standard procedure. You would have been detained, your vessel impounded, and a diplomatic inquiry opened. The process takes months. I have hours of air, not months. Yes, that was the relevant consideration. He paused. Standard procedure does not account for listening to someone refuse to die for 5 hours. It was difficult to reconcile filing an impound report on a person who had just taught herself to navigate by disassembling her own weapons system. Kale almost laughed. It came out as something between a laugh and the breath she'd been holding since 347. Your duty commander approved this, sending a patrol cruiser to help an unauthorized vessel. Commander Kareth Voss, she said, I am quoting precisely, the Council can draft their procedures around our after-action report, dispatch the cruiser. She was not amenable to delay. The Vorathi engineering team entered the Juno Kite with Kale's permission. They were methodical, respectful, and efficient in a way that reminded Kale of good dockworkers anywhere, people who knew how to be inside someone else's ship without disturbing what didn't need disturbing. They supplemented her oxygen, filling her tanks to full capacity, enough for 40 hours. They scanned her hull for stress fractures from the Red Line burn and the asteroid run, found 2 hairline cracks in the engine 2 mounting strut, and sealed them with a compound from their toolkit. They examined the breach in Bay 2 and confirmed what Kale already knew: the cargo there was unrecoverable. Then the engineering lead, a Vorathi woman with the closely trimmed silver hair markings that seemed to indicate rank or seniority, spent 15 minutes examining Kale's firmware bridge. She pulled up the patch code on the secondary console, scrolled through it slowly, and made a sound that the translation device did not translate but which required no translation. Professional fascination. This is your calibration table, she asked, pointing to the turret-derived values. Derived from 847-point defense firing solutions, Kale confirmed. And this is your boot credential. Bypassed from the clock crystal oscillator's current seed cycle. The engineer looked at Kale for a long moment. Then she said, we have current charts for the entire Tessarine corridor. We can translate them into your coordinate format and load them directly to your navigation crystal. With proper charts, your transit time to the boundary drops to 4 hours. You do that. Pilot Mora, you taught your ship to navigate by feeding it its own weapons data because you refused to accept that your situation was impossible. We can give you a map. It seems the least complex gesture available. By 9:20, the Juno Kite had full oxygen, current Vorathi star charts loaded and translated into Terran navigation format, 2 repaired hull stress fractures, and an escort. The Tessarines reached cruising at matched velocity off her port quarter, guiding her on an optimized route to the nearest corridor boundary that was 4 hours of easy flying instead of 6 hours of desperate thrust. Kale Mora sat in her pilot's seat with clean air in her lungs, and a working navigation display glowing with charts she hadn't earned, given freely by people she'd never known existed until this morning. The Vorathi cruiser held station beside her, its pale blue-gray hull catching the light of the K-class variable like polished stone, and the 2 ships flew together through alien space toward a boundary that had been a wall 2 hours ago and was now just a line on a shared chart. She keyed her beacon one final time, not a distress signal anymore, a record. Mora Juno Kite, final status update, oxygen nominal 40 hours in reserve, navigation restored with current Voratha-provided charts, hull repaired, escort to corridor boundary in progress, estimated arrival 4 hours, escorting vessel, Tessarine's Reach, Vorathi Sovereignty Patrol. She paused, let the beacon carry silence for a moment. They heard me, everything. Every transmission I made thinking I was broadcasting into empty space. Every patch, every calculation, every improvisation. They heard me refuse to die for 5 hours, and then they sent a cruiser. Another pause. There's no treaty for this. No protocol, no diplomatic channel, no procedure. They just decided to help because they'd been listening. She closed her eyes, opened them. Kale Mora Juno Kite, beacon signing off. I'll file a proper report from Jessen once I'm across the boundary. Tell David his dog still owes me a shoe. Mora out. Drethais Vaughn, monitoring from the Tessarine's Reach, heard this final transmission. He did not file it in the intercept log. He filed it in a new administrative category he created at his console that morning. A category that hadn't existed in the Sovereignty's database before 4:35 station time. Category First Contact Unplanned. Subcategory Distress Response. Notes: the signal was encrypted for Terran ears. It was not addressed to us. The pilot did not know we were listening. She was talking to her own people, 31 light years away. We heard it because we monitor our own space, and because her encryption was inadequate against our systems. He added a line. The pilot solved her navigation failure, evaded autonomous intercept, derived inertial calibration from weapons data, bypassed her own security systems, and manufactured supplemental oxygen from cargo stock, alone, in 5 hours, with no assistance and no expectation of assistance. And one more. When asked why she kept transmitting, she would likely say she was logging for the record. The transmissions suggest a different answer. She was talking because silence meant giving up, and giving up was not within her operational parameters. Duty Commander Kareth Voss reviewed the file at shift's end. She approved it without modification. She attached a single-sentence recommendation that would travel upward through sovereignty channels, would reach the full council within a week, and would eventually become the opening line of the first formal diplomatic communication between the Vorathi sovereignty and the Terran coalition. The sentence read, "This species solves its own problems in silence, asks nothing of strangers, and does not stop working while it still draws breath. We should speak to them before someone else does." But that was politics, that was later. In the moment, in the quiet of the Tessarine corridor with the K-class variable shrinking behind them, there was only a 72-meter freighter and a Vorathi patrol cruiser flying side by side through space that belonged to neither of them and both of them at once. A human pilot with steady hands and 14 empty calcium peroxide containers rattling in her cargo bay. A Vorathi monitor who had spent his morning listening to someone refuse to die and had decided, somewhere in those 5 hours, that procedure could wait. The stars outside were still wrong. Wrong stars, wrong space, wrong side of a border that should never have been crossed. But the ship was flying, the pilot was breathing, the math in the end had closed. And that was enough.